Welcome to VSOW. Tonight we're undertaking a pretty intense deep dive. We're looking into one of those questions that, well, it just echoes through history, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's that profound, really challenging question about the ultimate value of liberty when you
Yeah.
pit it directly against, well, just staying alive, physical life itself.
Exactly. Those moments, those breaking points, where people look at their situation and decide that risk, rebellion, even facing death, it's preferable to just submitting.
And our mission tonight is to unpack that. We've got a stack of really powerful source material here. We're focusing on two huge declarations of resolve: Emmeline Pankhurst's Freedom or Death speech, and of course, Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death.
Two massive historical moments.
Right. And we want to contrast those demands, those sort of militant demands,
Yeah.
against the absolute systematic denial of liberty you find in, say, ancient Greek and Roman slavery. It's a stark contrast.
And then we cap it off by testing those historical feelings against a modern, quite chilling ethical dilemma.
Yeah, a thought experiment that really pushes the boundaries.
So the ultimate aim here is to really unpack the justification required for extreme action. Whether that's Henry calling for armed rebellion or Pankhurst leading this deliberate campaign, this civil war, she called it, through militant protest.
We want to understand that point. When do constitutional peaceful means get exhausted? When does submitting to injustice become so intolerable that people feel forced to confront life itself?
Okay, let's dive in. Part 1. Justifying Revolution, Henry and Pankhurst.
Let's start with Patrick Henry. We're talking 1775, the Second Virginia Convention. This is really the fuse being lit for the American Revolution.
And the mood there wasn't universally revolutionary yet, was it?
Not at all. Most delegates, the sort of political establishment in Virginia, they were moderates. They were desperately hoping they could still reconcile with Great Britain, avoid a war.
But Henry stood up and basically said, that's not going to happen.
He did. He argued that hope wasn't just naive, it was dangerous at this point. He wasn't just relying on emotion, though.
Right. He built a case, didn't he?
Right.
Based on the facts of the last decade.
Absolutely. He performed this cold, hard review. His argument was structured around the failure of trying to engage constitutionally, peacefully. He listed off the grievances, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act.
All the things they'd been complaining about for years.
Exactly. A whole decade of ignored petitions, remonstrances, and humble supplications sent to the king, sent to Parliament. His core point was devastatingly simple. If years of respectful appeals have only brought additional violence and insult, why on earth would you believe future appeals will work?
So he's saying, we tried talking, it didn't work. Time's up.
Pretty much. He concluded the time for reasoning, for hope, was over. And the proof was right there, he argued. The British deployments.
The soldiers and warships, that was his immediate tangible evidence. What was his logic there?
He forced the delegates to ask, why are they here? He pointed out, look, Britain just beat France in the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
There's no enemy in this quarter of the world that needs such a massive military buildup.
So if they aren't here to protect us.
Then the only logical conclusion, the inescapable one he presented, was that this martial array, all these ships and soldiers, especially around Boston, wasn't for colonial protection. It was solely intended to suppress American liberties, to, in his words, bind and rivet upon us those chains which the British ministry have been so long forging.
Wow. Shifting the view of those soldiers from protectors to jailers, essentially. Instruments of bondage.
That's the intellectual leap. That rhetorical shift is what you need for revolution. And it worked. It convinced enough of those moderates, it led directly to Virginia deciding to raise its own militia.
Just weeks before the shooting actually started at Lexington and Concord in April '75.
The timing is incredible. The power of that speech, and especially that iconic closing line, it's undeniable. And this is where our sources push us to be careful, distinguishing history from, let's say, historical myth-making.
I mean, the famous words themselves, give me liberty or give me death.
Exactly. That powerful text we read now wasn't actually recorded verbatim back in 1775.
That's a huge detail, often gets glossed over.
It is. The full dramatic version we know was actually written down by Henry's biographer, William Wirt, much later. Over 40 years later, in 1817, he used interviews with people who were there, eyewitnesses who survived.
So it's a reconstruction based on memory decades later.
Precisely. And this matters, I think, profoundly for how we understand political language and history. Wirt's text probably doesn't capture the exact words Henry spoke off the cuff, but it absolutely captures the essence, the spirit of that moment, of that time.
It shows how important a kind of agreed-upon narrative, maybe even a myth, is for something like a revolution.
I think so.
Hmm.
A society needs to collectively agree on why the sacrifice is justified. Wirt's text became that powerful declaration the revolution needed. It validated the memory, the collective understanding of this existential choice they were making.
Okay, so if Henry's speech is sort of the revolutionary myth of the voting man fighting a distant king for representation, let's jump forward. Almost 140 years, 1913.
To Emmeline Pankhurst.
Right. And she delivers a speech with a strikingly similar title, Freedom or Death. But this time, it's a woman fighting her own government, in England, just for the right to vote.
And the context is just as dramatic. She's speaking at Hartford, Connecticut in the U.S., and she deliberately frames the suffragette movement not as just protest, but as a genuine civil war waged by women.
She'd just been sentenced in England, hadn't she, to penal servitude.
Yes. And she uses this appearance to identify herself, quite pointedly, not as some polite advocate, but as a soldier who has temporarily left the field of battle. And she calls herself a dangerous person.
Setting the tone immediately.
Absolutely. And she highlights this deep, well, frankly, sexist irony in how revolution is viewed internationally.
How so?
She observes, look, if a man, say, a Russian fighting the Tsar, or a Chinese revolutionary, or even an Irish one seeking home rule, if he came to America talking about using force, Americans would understand. They'd sympathize. Because those men are often fighting for rights everyone sort of agrees they should have, at least in theory.
But for women.
But for women, she says, even in the 20th century, they first have to argue the very simple fact that women are human beings, just to justify using revolutionary methods to get basic citizenship rights. It's an extra hurdle men don't face.
That's a powerful point, and she declares the movement has changed.
Yes. She says the English suffrage movement has passed beyond the realm of advocacy. They're no longer just asking or persuading. They've entered the sphere of practical politics. And given how stubborn the government is, that sphere has become synonymous with revolution and civil war.
So there's the connection back to Henry again, that idea of an inherent right to rebel when peaceful means fail.
It's the exact same logic, applied to a different group denied a voice. She points out to her American audience, mostly voting men. Look, if you have a grievance, the constitutional path is clear. You vote out the politicians who won't listen. The system works for you, even if it's slow.
But for the voteless, like the American colonists before 75, or English women in 1913.
For the voteless, that constitutional path is a dead end. The government isn't accountable to them. So they face this stark choice. Either you submit forever to what you see as intolerable injustice,
Right.
or you rise up and adopt some of the antiquated means by which men in the past got their grievances remedied. And she deliberately invokes American history here.
The Boston Tea Party.
Exactly. She says, your forefathers fought over taxation without representation. We, the suffragettes, are doing the same thing. We're confirming that inherent right of revolution and rebellion on the part of human beings suffering from an intolerable injustice.
Okay, so both Henry and Pankhurst argue revolution becomes legitimate when the system offers no other path. But Pankhurst's methods, the militancy, drew a lot of criticism, right? Especially breaking windows, property damage. It was painted as irrational.
Oh, absolutely. She was acutely aware of that narrative, particularly in the American press, this idea of hysterical women smashing things randomly. And she just dismantles it in this speech.
How does she justify it?
She insists it's not random. It's not done to convict people. They weren't naive. They knew breaking a shop window wouldn't magically change a politician's mind about votes for women.
So what was it then?
She calls it a practical political means. And crucially, she argues it's the only means available to people without a political voice to create a situation so disruptive, so inconvenient, that it simply has to be solved politically.
It sounds more like an economic strategy than terrorism.
That's a good way to put it. She even quotes a homely English proverb. You cannot rouse the Britisher unless you touch his pocket.
Hit them where it hurts, financially.
Precisely. The goal was to target the interests that propped up the government business, professionals, the leisure class, make their lives, their profits, their pleasures uncomfortable enough that they would pressure the government to just give women the vote and make the disruption stop.
So create political gridlock that only enfranchisement could solve.
Exactly. Not trying to win hearts and minds through violence, but forcing a political solution through targeted economic and social disruption.
She had that analogy, didn't she? About the babies.
Yes. The patient baby versus the impatient baby. It's so effective. The patient baby that was them, doing polite advocacy for 50 years, gets ignored. But the impatient baby cries lustily, screams and kicks, and makes everybody unpleasant until it is fed. That, she says, is the whole history of politics when you're voiceless.
And the targets they chose really reflect that strategy, don't they?
They do. Breaking shopkeepers' windows right at the start of the winter shopping season that forces them to board up displays, lose money. That gets the business community agitated.
And the golf courses.
Attacking golf links, destroying the greens, which take ages and a lot of money to cultivate that, directly hits the weekend pleasures of the upper-class men, the very men holding the political power, absorbed in their leisure. It wakes them up.
It's calculated. Disruptive, but calculated. And importantly, they were focused on property, not people.
Yes, that was a key distinction they maintained, which makes the double standard she points out even more shocking. The comparison she draws between her movement and Sir Edward Carson.
Okay, explain that. Who is Carson?
Sir Edward Carson was a very distinguished figure, a top lawyer, a statesman, and crucially, a man with the vote. At this exact time, he was leading a potential revolt in Ulster, Northern Ireland, against the idea of Irish Home Rule.
And he wasn't just talking, was he?
Not at all. He was actively advocating for civil war. He was justifying bloodshed to defend what he called Ulster's manhood rights. He was involved in organizing militias, importing weapons, basically threatening armed insurrection against the state.
Okay, so a prominent voting man threatening actual war and bloodshed. What was the government's response to him?
Nothing. Pankhurst uses this brilliant, biting phrase. She calls him a chartered libertine. He could advocate taking human life, organize for war, and he was not arrested. He wasn't charged with conspiracy or anything.
The establishment basically treated his threats as legitimate political discourse, even if extreme.
Because he was a man and, importantly, a voter. His actions, however dangerous, were seen within a political framework. But Pankhurst, whose stated policy was always to avoid injuring human life, who limited her actions to property damage as a political tactic, she was arrested, charged, and sentenced to 3 years of hard penal servitude.
The contrast is just stark.
It's utterly staggering. It forces you to ask, does the system find state-threatening armed violence from a voting man less dangerous than non-lethal, politically motivated agitation from voteless women?
The answer seems to be yes.
It confirms Pankhurst's point. Carson had constitutional ways to fight home rule, but he chose violence with impunity. The suffragettes had no constitutional recourse, and they were criminalized for using revolutionary methods. It suggests the state feared the political power of women getting the vote far more than it feared Carson's guns.
And this civil war the women waged, it evolved, didn't it? Became harder to stop.
It did. It escalated from the early days of just asking questions at political meetings for which women were, as the sources say, brutally ill-used and jailed, while men doing the same were just tolerated. It escalated to organized, real militancy run like an army campaign.
And part of its power was its invisibility.
Exactly. The government was fighting an enemy they couldn't easily identify or locate. Pankhurst points out, women are everywhere. In every class, they wear no mark. How could you tell, she asks, if a respectable-looking daughter posting a letter is arranging a tennis match or putting corrosive matter in the pillar box to destroy the mail?
That uncertainty must have been terrifying for the authorities.
It was a huge asset, this pervasive unseen threat. And their actions were incredibly effective technologically, too.
Like the communication disruption.
Yeah, imagine this. For one whole day, all telegraph and telephone communication between Glasgow and London, the major business artery, was entirely suspended. And they did it without causing a single injury. It shows real ingenuity in hitting the system where it hurt, disrupting business, creating chaos the government couldn't ignore.
So this persistent, non-lethal but high-impact campaign, it backed the government into a corner.
That's exactly how Pankhurst frames it. She says they forced the government to face a final, awful alternative. Either women are to be killed or women are to have the vote.
A stark choice.
By refusing to consent to the injustice, by making the system ungovernable for them, the women were challenging the very basis of state power. It validated her claim that government does not rest upon force at all, it rests upon consent. Withdraw that consent, and the state's legitimacy crumbles.
But the government's immediate response wasn't concession, it was repression. Severe repression.
Absolutely. It started with the hunger strike. The women adopted this tactic, following the example of Russian revolutionaries, as a protest against being unjustly imprisoned as criminals rather than political prisoners. It forced the authorities. Either let these women die in prison, which would be a PR disaster, or let them go free.
A powerful moral weapon. But the government found a way around it, didn't they? A brutal way.
They did. They resorted to forcible feeding. The sources are clear. The British government deliberately set an example by forcibly feeding sane, resisting human beings. It was described as a terrible ordeal, essentially state-sanctioned torture designed to break their will.
And even when that wasn't enough, they legislated.
Yes, the infamous Cat and Mouse Act. This was incredibly cynical legislation. It allowed them to release a hunger-striking woman when she was close to death,
Let her recover at home.
keep her under surveillance, effectively on license, until she regained her strength, and then haul her back to prison to serve the rest of her sentence. Then the cycle would repeat.
A revolving door of suffering designed to crush the movement.
That was the intent. But Pankhurst testifies it failed. Utterly. Because, as she put it, nothing on earth and nothing in heaven will make women give way. Their refusal to consent, their commitment, had become absolute.
It's so important, though, to connect this intense political fight, this willingness to endure torture and imprisonment, back to the actual conditions women faced. This wasn't just about an abstract right to vote, was it?
Not at all. Pankhurst explicitly links the fight for the ballot to the crushing social and economic realities. They were fighting for survival, for basic dignity.
Let's talk about those conditions, the industrial situation, for example.
Our sources paint a bleak picture. The average wage for female industrial workers, and this included even highly skilled women like teachers, was shockingly low. Less than $2 a week, apparently.
Less than $2.
And worse, the government itself, as the country's largest employer, was part of the problem. It actively set a horribly bad example by consistently replacing men's labor with women's at lower wages, driving down wages for everyone, but especially women.
So economic exploitation institutionalized by the state itself. What about the legal situation? Marriage, motherhood?
It codified female subservience. Legally, a girl could be married off at 12 years old, 12, and a wife could work her entire life, contribute significantly to the household income, maybe even build up savings. But if her husband died and chose to will all that money away, perhaps to a mistress, perhaps elsewhere, she could be left completely penniless. She had no legal claim to the marital property she helped create.
And her rights regarding her children.
Virtually non-existent during the father's lifetime. The mother had no legal say in the child's upbringing, education, religion, even custody. Legally, the child belongs solely to the father. It's a stark denial of basic parental rights, reinforcing the idea that women lacked full personhood.
And divorce.
The laws enforced a blatant double standard. A husband could divorce his wife for a single act of infidelity. But the law effectively encouraged, or at least tolerated, male infidelity. Pankhurst points out the grim social reality that the wise wife was often considered the one who simply closed her eyes to the moral feelings of her husband.
So the suffrage movement wasn't just political, it was deeply moral and social.
Exactly. Pankhurst saw it as tackling a social disease, addressing the moral degradation embedded in the legal system. They understood, fundamentally, that to raise the status of women, to enforce an equal moral standard, to gain basic human dignity and legal parity, they absolutely needed political power. The vote wasn't the end goal. It was the essential tool.
Okay, so we've seen Henry and Pankhurst articulating this powerful demand. Liberty is essential, perhaps even more valuable than life itself, when faced with certain forms of subjugation. To really grasp the horror they were rejecting, we need to look at the other extreme. The ultimate systematic denial of liberty in ancient slavery.
Right. If Henry and Pankhurst feared being forced into metaphorical chains, ancient slavery in Greece and Rome represents the literal, institutionalized reality of those chains. It's the absolute antithesis of personhood.
We need to be precise about terms here, don't we? What kind of slavery are we mostly talking about?
Primarily, we're looking at chattel slavery. That's where the slave, the doulos Greek, was considered actual property, like livestock or furniture, bought, sold, leased, disposable. This is distinct from other unfree groups, like the Spartan Helots or the Thessalian Penestae. They were more like medieval serfs, tied to the land, not individually owned chattel.
And the language used really underscores their objectification.
It does. You mentioned the term andropodon. It literally means one with the feet of a man. And it was used specifically to contrast slaves with tetrapodon, four-footed animals, livestock. So their humanity is acknowledged only in the barest biological sense to distinguish them from animals, which just highlights how much they were seen as object.
And economically, this wasn't some marginal institution. It was central.
It was the engine of the ancient world. Slaves were the backbone of agriculture. They worked the quarries and especially the mines. The Laurian silver mines near Athens are a truly horrific example. Estimates suggest maybe 30,000 slaves worked there under appalling conditions.
Which means constant death and a constant need for new slaves.
Exactly. A high mortality rate was just factored in. Even craft workshops relied heavily on them. One source mentions Lysias's shield factory using 120 slaves. Pretty much every sector used slave labor, except, crucially, politics. That was reserved for the free.
And the sheer numbers in a place like Athens.
Athens had the largest slave population. Estimates go up to maybe 80,000 in the 5th and 6th centuries BC. That averages out to about 3 or 4 slaves per household. The sources are pretty clear. If you didn't own at least one slave, you were likely considered quite poor.
It shows how completely normalized this horrific institution was. Where did all these people come from?
Several main sources. War was a big one. The victor in battle traditionally had absolute rights over the vanquished, and mass enslavement was common. Though interestingly, even back then, some generals occasionally refused, finding it morally questionable, which shows it wasn't universally accepted without critique. Piracy and banditry were constant sources. Think of areas like Cilicia in modern-day Turkey, notorious pirate havens. They'd capture people, and if ransom wasn't paid, off to the slave market they went.
And organized trade.
Oh, yes. A sophisticated international slave trade existed. Local dealers would sell people, sometimes even their own countrymen, to merchants. You even saw certain nationalities consistently represented in specific roles, like the Scythian archers who served as a police force in Athens.
And when bought, they were treated just like any other commodity.
Completely. Buyers actually got a guarantee against latent defects, just like you would when buying an animal or an object. It cements their status as valuable property, but definitely not as people with rights.
And the last source, particularly in early Athens, debt.
Right. Before the famous reforms of Solon around 594 BC as Hesychthia, the shaking off of burdens, Athenian citizens could actually fall into slavery themselves. If a poor farmer, a hectomoroi, couldn't pay his debts, his creditor could seize him and his family and sell them into slavery.
Solon put a stop to that.
He did. His reform was truly revolutionary for citizens. He forbade the selling of free Athenians into slavery ever again, whether for debt or any other reason. He didn't abolish slavery itself, far from it, but he drew a crucial line. For Athenian citizens, loss of liberty would no longer be the price of poverty, a massive step for civil liberty within the citizen class.
So once someone was enslaved, what was their actual legal status?
Legally, they were summa, literally, a body. They were the property of their master, or in some cases, the state. And crucially, the state refused to recognize any family relationships between slaves.
Meaning families could be broken up.
Easily. Husbands, wives, parents, children. They could be sold off individually, scattered at the master's whim, with no legal recourse. It's a fundamental denial of human connection.
What about rights in court? Could they testify?
Minimally. A slave's testimony was generally considered inadmissible unless it was extracted under torture.
Torture was required. Why?
The horrifying logic was that only extreme physical pain could overcome a slave's assumed natural loyalty to their master. So, torture became a standard, legally sanctioned way to get truth from a slave. It validates torture as a routine legal tool.
I read that citizens could sometimes prosecute a master for mistreating a slave, though.
Yes, but we need to be really careful about the reason why. The prosecution wasn't brought for the slave's benefit, or because the slave had rights being violated.
So why then?
It was a prosecution against hubris on the part of the master. Hubris meaning excessive arrogance, violent insolence. Displaying that kind of unchecked tyrannical power over anyone, even a slave, was seen as a threat to the moral order of the city, an insult to the community. The slave was just the object through which the master committed this social transgression. It reinforces that the slave was a non-person in the eyes of the law.
So their suffering only mattered if it reflected badly on the master's character in a way that offended the community.
Exactly. Now, compared to places like Sparta, Athenian slaves did have some relative license. Sources say they couldn't just be struck casually in the street and even fought alongside citizens at the Battle of Marathon.
But freedom was still entirely dependent on the master.
Entirely. Manumission, being freed, was always at the owner's discretion. Often, the slave had to somehow earn enough money to buy their own freedom, paying their market value back to the master.
And even if freed, they weren't quite equal.
No. They typically became metics, resident foreigners. They often still had obligations to their former master. Plato even suggested that freedmen should report to their former master's home 3 times a month. A constant reminder that their freedom was granted, conditional, not inherent.
This whole experience, this stripping away of identity and rights, the sociologist Orlando Patterson called it social death.
Yes, it's a powerful concept. If Henry and Pankhurst fought for political life, ancient slaves were systematically subjected to social death. Patterson argues slavery robs the individual of any socially recognized existence outside of his master. They become a social non-person.
And he identified key elements of this.
Two main criteria, all clear in our sources. First, natal alienation. Most slaves were foreign-born, barbaroi, forcibly relocated, cut off from their homeland, their kin, their culture. This alienation made it easier psychologically for citizens to deny their personhood, to see them as other.
Makes sense. Second,
Permanence. Slavery was usually heritable. Freedom wasn't an inherent right you could pass on. It was always contingent on the master's choice, generation after generation. The dishonor was perpetual.
and third, the violence.
Dishonor, domination, and violence. Slaves were constantly subject to the master's power, including physical punishment. Aristotle's infamous definition, living tools, or animate property, sums it up. Flogging, branding, torture. These weren't aberrations. They were standard, legally sanctioned methods of control. As Demosthenes noted, the body of a slave is made responsible for all his misdeeds. Their physical body was the only thing the law ultimately held accountable.
Turning quickly to Rome, similar brutality. Owners could kill slaves without punishment.
Yes, the owner's power, patria potestas, was initially absolute, including the power of life and death over slaves. But Roman slavery had some distinct features. Crucially, it wasn't based on race. Slaves came from everywhere, prisoners of war, victims of piracy, even children sold by desperately poor Roman citizens.
But there was maybe slightly more hope in the Roman system, manumission.
Yes, the potential for manumission was perhaps more integrated into the Roman system, acting as a significant incentive for obedience. And formal manumission in Rome was unique. It granted the freed person full Roman citizenship.
The citizenship, that's huge.
It was. Although the freedman himself, Libertus, couldn't hold high political office, his children could. So it offered a genuine pathway, over a generation or two, into the heart of Roman civic life. That possibility, however remote for many, was a powerful psychological tool.
And finally, there's a different kind of challenge to slavery in the source as a spiritual one. Paul's letter to Philemon.
Right, this is fascinating. Paul doesn't issue a command, you must free your slave Onesimus. There's no explicit legal prohibition of slavery.
So how does he undermine it?
He applies the radical ethics of the new Christian community. He sends the runaway slave, Onesimus, back to his Christian master Philemon, but with extraordinary instructions. Philemon must receive him no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother. He must treat Onesimus exactly as he would treat Paul himself.
Treating property as an equal brother.
It makes the legal relationship of master-chattel incompatible with the spiritual demands of Christian fellowship, which required love and equality in the Lord. Paul doesn't attack the law directly, but he introduces a spiritual reality that, if truly lived out, makes the institution morally impossible to sustain within that community. The system might survive the legal code, but not absolute spiritual equality.
Okay, we've laid out the political demand for liberty over life from Henry and Pankhurst, and the appalling reality of life without liberty in ancient slavery. Now, let's bring this clash into the modern ethical arena with that thought experiment you mentioned.
Yes, this is a really stark variant of the classic trolley problem. It directly tests that liberty or death premise, but not rhetorically accurately.
Scenario.
You, the observer, have a choice. You can let a runaway trolley continue on its path and kill 5 people, or you can pull a lever. Pulling the lever diverts the trolley, saving the 5 lives, but it sends the trolley down a different track, where it triggers a mechanism that condemns 25 completely unrelated people to a life of perpetual, inescapable, brutal slavery and torture.
5 quick deaths versus 25 lives of permanent agony and subjugation.
Exactly. Now, if you were a pure utilitarian, just maximizing the number of lives saved, the choice is mathematically simple. Pull the lever, save the 25, condemn them to slavery, but they live.
But the online discussions around this dilemma show people really struggle with that. It's not simple at all.
Not in the slightest. The overwhelming reaction is revulsion at the utilitarian choice. Most people argue that lifelong slavery and torture is much worse than a terrifying but quick death.
They're trying to weigh the harm, aren't they?
Right. How do you compare the magnitude? One commenter framed it perfectly. It's like comparing 25 drawn-out, agonizing deaths over decades, which is what they equated slavery torture to, versus 5 quick deaths. The feeling is that the protracted, permanent, inflicted suffering of slavery is a greater evil than a swift, albeit tragic, fatality, even when the numbers favor saving the enslaved.
And some argue that causing the slavery by pulling a lever feels morally worse than allowing the 5 deaths by doing nothing.
That's a common factor, too. But ultimately, the decision often swings back to that core phrase we've been tracking, the liberty or death litmus test, taken absolutely literally.
Why does it become literal here?
Because the scenario specifies the slavery is immutable, there's no escape, no hope of manumission, no resistance possible. It's total, perpetual subjugation. And faced with that specific horror, many people invoke history.
They bring up examples.
Yes, they cite examples like the defenders of Masada choosing mass suicide over Roman slavery, or historical accounts of enslaved people taking their own lives rather than enduring bondage. They use these examples to say, see, people genuinely have preferred death to certain forms of existence. Their choice validates the idea that some states of being are considered worse than non-existence.
But there's a counter-argument raised in the discussion, isn't there, about the will to live?
Yes, a crucial one. Someone points out, well, historically, despite the horrors, the vast majority of enslaved people did choose to live. They endured. They adapted. They mention concepts like hedonic adaptation, our ability to adjust our happiness baseline, even to terrible circumstances, and the fundamental biological will to live.
So does that change the ethical calculation? If we know most people, in reality, cling to life even in bondage, should the person at the lever prioritize saving the 25, respecting that biological imperative, even into slavery?
That's the deep conundrum. Are you obligated to choose based on the likely preference of the individuals involved, which might be life, however degraded, or based on a philosophical principle about what constitutes a life worth living?
It pits biology against dignity, almost.
In a way. But the political declarations of Henry and Pankhurst weren't really about biology. They were about dignity, consent, the necessary conditions for a life worthy of a human being, as they defined it. And the consensus in the thought experiment seems to lean towards that philosophical stance.
So, faced with immutable, absolute slavery, the choice defaults back to liberty or death.
It seems so. Sacrificing the 25 is seen by many not as murder, but as a defense of the inherent value of personhood itself, a refusal to participate in creating a state worse than death. It suggests that even today, the spirit of Henry and Pankhurst, the refusal to consent to intolerable injustice, even at the ultimate cost, resonates deeply.
It shows those historical declarations weren't just rhetoric for a rally. They represent a rigorous philosophical position about the baseline of acceptable human existence.
Precisely.
So, wrapping this up, we've journeyed from the political battlefields, the American Revolution's fight for self-governance, the suffragette civil war for legal personhood, and starkly contrasted those demands for liberty with the absolute negation of it in ancient slavery.
And the thread running through it all is this recurring, powerful theme that freedom, whether it's political citizenship, bodily autonomy, basic human dignity, is sometimes valued, even by people with everything to lose, as more fundamental than the mere biological continuation of life under conditions of total subjugation.
Henry and Pankhurst both defined political subjugation, taxation without representation, legal non-personhood as a form of chains, because it violently denied the human right to consent to how one is governed.
And Pankhurst's assertion that government rests on consent, not force, becomes incredibly potent when you juxtapose it with slavery, an institution built entirely on the violent denial of consent.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If government truly rests on consent, and if systems built on the denial of consent are fundamentally unjust, as history seems to show,
then we have to ask ourselves, what intolerable injustices exist in our world today that are being maintained primarily through force, precisely because the consent of the governed or the oppressed has been withdrawn or was never sought in the first place?
think about the modern chains being forged. Are they digital, tied to data and autonomy? Are they economic, rooted in entrenched inequality? Are they environmental, impacting future generations who haven't consented?
What systems today rely on coercion, on simply ignoring the lack of consent, because acknowledging it would force fundamental change? That's the enduring question that the voices of Henry Pankhurst and even the silent suffering of the enslaved compel us to confront.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the price of freedom, the cost of chains, and the enduring tension between liberty and life. If you found this discussion compelling, if it sparked some thoughts, please do remember to subscribe, like, and maybe drop a comment with your own perspective on this balance. We genuinely love hearing from you and finding out what subjects you're curious about.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.